For each episode, we take the time to support our guests in developing their story. I learned a lot from Fatemeh. Some people do not always struggle in sharing key moments of their lives to convey a message or what drives them, while others have never done so. And this can be an unsettling experience which we approach with care. And that is what we did with Fatemeh. My name is Janet, and the closest I have come to the struggles of migrants is via my grandmother's experience of exile from Normandy during the D-Day landing in 1944. However, this is not breaking news. The newcomers I have met and the stories from them have changed the way I see and act. Being a white French woman gives me certain privileges, which I've decided to use to promote the voices and stories we do not hear enough. And for this new episode, we meet Fatemeh Jailani.
When I was 5 years old, in the middle of the night, I would suddenly wake up to the sound of my parents' voice saying, "What? Who was killed? What happened? Who disappeared?" I felt so sad because my parents were sad. I knew that even if I am warm in my bed, somewhere far away, there is a world of unrest, a world of war and death. My parents knew that world, but I didn't. I just knew their pain. That memory says a lot about my childhood. I grew up knowing that there was another place, and elsewhere, where the people my parents loved were suffering. As a kid, I grew up knowing that in other places in the world, peace was not a given. Bombs would fall from the sky. Those bombs killed people that my parents loved. My older siblings were much more aware of the situation than I was. My parents left Afghanistan about 3 years after the Soviet invasion because my father was unjustly sent to prison for 6 months, so 2 years following that invasion. When he was released, for fear that the authorities would come back for him, my parents, with my older brother and older sister, left the country with a passer. They crossed the border by various means, car, foot, and arrived in Peshawar, where they lived in limbo for the next 2 years until they were accepted to the US. My mother, she was 6 months pregnant with me when they immigrated to the US. They lost everything, and they had to start over from nothing, while at the same time coping with the guilt of all the people they had to leave behind. My dad had a family business in Afghanistan. He had built a whole life there for himself and for his family. In the United States, he started working at a gas station. Then he bought a truck and decided to become an entrepreneur and sold fruit on the streets of downtown LA for more than 10 years from that truck. Often we don't think that selling fruit on the streets is a form of entrepreneurship, but it is. Entrepreneurship, however modest, was the only solution for my dad to get out of poverty because he would have never found a job willing to pay him enough to support a family. My dad once told me that he chose California because he thought to himself that it was the ideal place. It's always sunny in California. I think he was nostalgic of all the American movies he watched in Kabul. I do not think he ever thought he would find himself in the heart of one of the neighborhoods coping with gang violence, in a tiny apartment with 4 children. I really don't think he ever thought that his oldest son would get shot in a drive-by. I personally loved my childhood, despite the difficulties we faced. I didn't have anything else to compare it to. I had neighbors my age with whom I played. Their parents were also newcomers, except for the Bugbees. They were the real Americans, as in there in the United States for many, many, many generations. They were my first exposure to an American family, like the ones you see in that series Full House. They were great, and I remember how often they helped me with my homework when my parents couldn't. However, with the other kids I mentioned, We spoke the same language without necessarily speaking about it directly. I don't know if that makes sense. We kind of shared the same traumas. Like we knew that our parents came from an elsewhere that we would never fully grasp. Like sometimes they would cry or feel angry or get silent, and that we just had to give them their space so they could cope when that happens. I remember the front porch. Every time I would come home from playing outside, I would see my mom sitting on that front porch. And I knew that something was wrong, or someone had died. God, you can't imagine how much I hated that porch. I think for a while there was always this hope that maybe they would go back to Afghanistan. In the beginning, they would talk about Afghanistan like this Garden of Eden. I didn't know what it was. I could hardly pronounce the name of the country at first as a kid. But I heard them talk so much about it. Nothing was sweeter than the fruit in Afghanistan. The water was the purest. The fresh bread from the nanwali couldn't compare to what we found in the supermarkets here. We had a house, a business, and one day we will go back. Well, that day never came. I grew up in California, and they had to start over. I don't remember exactly how old I was, maybe 11, when I told my dad, "Why don't you wear a suit like the dads on TV, or the other dads of the other kids in school when you go to work? Why don't you have a suitcase?" That sad look my dad gave me, I will never forget. I still hate myself for saying that to him, not realizing how much of his pride he had to swallow every day to do the work he did. Both my parents, in fact. My parents decided after a certain period of time to move us to a better neighborhood with a better school system because they feared we would get caught up in the wrong gang or worse, get shot. I think I could say with certainty that whatever nonchalance I had as a child ended there. It's kind of ironic if you think about it, that I feel like my childhood ended when we left the more troubled neighborhood. It's just that in this new neighborhood, I really felt different compared to the other kids in school. I didn't live in a huge house. I didn't go on vacation to Hawaii or Europe. I didn't have parents that could socialize with the other parents to make play dates because they worked day and night. My parents were judged for their broken English when they had parent-teacher meetings. Even worse, I was discriminated against in school because I said that I spoke another language other than English at home. So I was put in a slower program called ESL, English as a Second Language. That program was meant for kids that just arrived in the country. I had no idea why I was there. I was born in the US, and it took me years to get out of that program. And the only reason I was able to get out was because my English teacher, Miss McCall, in junior high, petitioned for me to get out. Thank you, Miss McCall. You saved my education. Living in that neighborhood, I remember understanding for the first time what it meant not to be white, but also what it meant not coming from a higher social class. At least the kids in the more disfavorable neighborhoods had stories that resembled mine. It did get better midway, though, when I went to junior high and high school. I remember befriending an Egyptian-American girl whose drive to succeed really inspired me. Then I went on to meet other hyphenated kids like me, Mexican-American, Brazilian-American, Honduran-American, who understood more or less my struggles. But even despite all that, I always felt like I had to play a role to fit in. Like I couldn't show the other sides of my life because the people around me didn't have the insight to fully grasp my reality and show empathy or understanding. And that feeling followed me. It followed me well into my adult years. Maybe I was wrong, I have no idea. But the few times I showed any vulnerability, it catastrophically blew up in my face. So, I developed a dual identity. I was one person at home and another person at school. Growing up, most of the time I felt like I was moving forward more or less blindfolded. There was no one next to me to help me understand the complexity of my identity, particularly when my parents were going through their own identity crisis, because it was during my adolescence that they had to come to terms with the idea that they were never going back to Afghanistan. And then, boom, 9/11 happened. And that identity of mine became so much more complex. I was a junior in high school when the Twin Towers fell. It was a horrible year. My grandmother, who lived with us, just died before. She never saw a liberated Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, from then on out, everyone knew about Afghanistan. All of a sudden, the Taliban are gone and the country reopens. All of a sudden, music is being played on the streets. And maybe, just maybe, my parents might no longer have to nurse an open wound anymore. And all of a sudden, my Afghanness finally means something to my peers. But not in the way I was hoping. When my father came to the US, he never lost his pride because at the time, like the Ukrainians, Afghans were fighting against the Soviet Union. Afghans were brave. We had a landlord that, despite my parents' pleas, wouldn't charge us rent because this former Vietnam veteran empathized greatly with my parents. 18 years later, after their exile, Afghanistan is presented as something else. Afghanistan is associated with terrorism. Islam is associated with terrorism. And so began the war on terror, whatever the hell that means. And I was still walking around with a blindfold. Toni Morrison once wrote, "I am convinced that clarity about who one is and what one's work is inextricably bound up with one's place in a tribe, or a family, or a nation, or a race, or a sex, or what have you. And the clarity is necessary for the evaluation of the self, and it is necessary for any productive intercourse with any other tribe or culture. I am not suggesting a collection of warring cultures, just clear ones. For it is out of the clarity of one's own culture that life within another, near another, and juxtaposition to another is healthily possible." I remember I was 27, in Paris, living my life as a young professional, and I organized a going-away get-together for an American friend that was moving back to the US. A common friend of ours asked me if I could invite a friend of hers, our age, who was working or worked in Afghanistan. I don't remember exactly. The only thing I remember from that night is feeling so transgressed when I met this woman. Everything about this woman bothered me, but I couldn't really understand why. I remember her posture when she spoke about her experience in Afghanistan. Like, despite the fact she didn't speak a word of Dari, she felt like she was legitimate to talk about the people and history of that country. I remember she said something like, "The Soviets liberated the women of Afghanistan." The Soviets did a lot of things, horrible things. But to say that they liberated the women, everyone listened to what she was saying as if she was this authority figure on the matter. And I felt like she was lacking a lot of nuance in what she was saying. Yet for some reason, I didn't feel legitimate enough to say anything. She spent months there within an expat context, and I didn't know what I was at the time to counter her arguments. And I felt like she took something away from me that night, while forcing me to face myself. It was brutal, and it shook my wobbly foundations for months. That was the moment I was finally becoming more aware. The blindfold was slowly coming off. It was as if something inside me was screaming to just stop, for God's sakes, playing into the perception of others. and also stop being silent about it. Moving to Paris for my studies, one would think that it would add more complexity to my identity. Perhaps it did for a while. But it also allowed me to take a step back and better understand my parents as immigrants, refugees, my socialization in the United States with such a heritage, and so much more. It was like navigating so many cultural and socioeconomic contexts. I was starting to see the world above and beyond how our societies tend to condition us. I was starting to confront a lot of contradictions, starting with my own. I loved living in Paris because I met an intellectual Parisian world that valorized my Afghanness. It was cool to be Afghan, particularly at Sciences Po within an intellectual context. It took me a while to understand the fetishization in that and how violent it was for the young woman I was. And at the same time, I was considered American by the Americans I met in Paris. Americans with whom I probably would not have built a relationship if we were in the US. Sometimes I think it's funny, actually, that I had to cross the Atlantic to finally be considered as American. It's also funny how different contexts and perceptions can either open or close doors. It was like in Paris, I could be everything I couldn't be in the US. It made me realize the role of perception and how romanticized projections of your culture and ethnicity is better than a fearful or indifferent projection. And for a time, I relished in it. I relished in it because it was better than what I experienced in the US. And that's something that's really hard to admit to myself. And it's hard to admit that I gave so much power to people and their perception of me. Living in Paris, I realized that I had this great capacity to adapt because I came from a minority culture that not a lot of people knew about nor really understood. So at a young age, I always tried to build bridges and bend myself to make others feel comfortable about my differences. And at one point, I realized that by bending and bending and bending, well, I just broke. I just broke into a million pieces. Thankfully. I say thankfully because sometimes it's through the cracks that we finally see the light. I saw a lot of things. The traumas I normalized, the different shades of discrimination I was subjected to, the lack of self-agency, the need to always prove myself. It's very hard for me to find the right words to describe what I lived for so many years. And that moment of epiphany saved me, but for lack of a better word, it also damned me. Because when you break all the biases that you interiorized, your whole life flashes before your eyes and you realize all the suffering that could have been avoided and all the traumas that you have to cope with today as a result of that suffering. That realization hurts like hell. It's kind of like Stranger Things when you see an upside down that not everyone sees. And when you meet people like that woman that worked in Afghanistan that does not realize the weight of her words about a group of people that do not always have the means to defend their own story to the West, or the pseudo-intellectuals that fetishize your culture or sees you as a token friend without really wanting to enter into the tragedies and injustices to which their countries have probably contributed to, or the unaware comments of people that are indifferent or biased about people who share the same struggles as your parents. You feel angry at them. You feel angry at them, but you also feel angry at yourself because you realize that we all have those biases. We are all guilty of those biases that still keep so many people shackled. That is the social injustice I see today. And those perceptions of populations and wealthy nations determine the policies we apply to the rest of the world. I also realized that I grew up borderless in a world that is attached to borders, to nation states, to static cultures, or to binary political systems. The world is so much more complex than that. Our shared humanity tomorrow and our capacity to work together depends greatly on whether or not we can relate to someone that does not resemble us at all. When we look at our global challenges, one thing is clear. We need to learn to work together for the future of humanity. Despite what some might have you believe, cultures have always evolved since the beginning of human history. And in that process, I realized that I can decide the culture I want to have based on the universal values that my favorite writers and philosophers have defended, and then decorate it with my life experiences. I want my culture to build on the lessons of the past, stay aware of the present, and reflect my hope for the future. In that culture, maybe I might be the master of none, but at least that lack of certainty, the lack of one dominant culture, well, at least that keeps my ears and my eyes open. I feel like the day I clarified my own evolving culture, my relationship with others became much more clear. Khalil Gibran wrote, "A faith is an oasis in the heart which will never be reached by the caravan of thinking." It was the summer of 2021. It was 2 or 3 a.m. I don't remember exactly. And I was on the phone with my cousin, Amina, trying to convince her to get on the last French plane leaving Kabul. There was only one spot for her, but not for her family. That night is burned into my memory. The days before, I had spent so much time collecting her paperwork, IDs, work papers, diplomas, recommendation letters, and the same documents for her family. And I was sending those documents to any organization that was working on evacuating Afghans before the deadline. That bloody deadline. That bloody deadline where Western organizations had to leave the country. I felt like I was trying to convince organizations that she and her family are people of value, people that will contribute to your societies if you welcome them. It was so sad. And the only help I got was from Singa. They did everything to try to get her out. But in the end, she couldn't abandon her family. I was devastated. I remember not being able to get out of bed for a week following that episode. I remember thinking, why not her? Why me? And why not her? I joined Singa in 2021, following the fall of Kabul. And if that didn't happen, I don't know if I would have had the courage to assume this engagement fully. I took a leap of faith into an experience that brought me full circle. James Baldwin once said, "An identity would seem to be arrived at by the way in which the person faces and uses his experiences." The fall of Kabul was a tragedy in our family, and I finally understood what my parents lived in the 80s and 90s. That feeling of helplessness when you know that the people you care about are trapped and suffering. My parents who were not so accessible to me growing up, well, suddenly I got a taste of their reality, the reality that they had to face when I was a child. And this time around, Afghans were not presented under the best light. They were presented to the West as a people that did not stand up and fight, as cowards. Biden created a negative perception in the psychology of citizens in the US about Afghans. Afghans who are now risking their lives to flee the Taliban regime. Afghans who need asylum in other countries. The perception of rich countries will determine their capacity to welcome. I joined Singa because I felt like maybe, just maybe, everything I lived, Everything I experience could serve the goals of this organization and create a more welcoming society. Singa aims to ensure the inclusion of newcomers in our society through the creation of social connections, entrepreneurship, and innovative solutions that prove that we have the capacity to welcome, that pushes our imagination to imagine a world where we welcome migrants, and that could potentially change the narrative on this polarizing topic. I am living proof that there is potential in welcoming migrants. My parents today demonstrate the value that migrants can bring to other societies. My dad was able to develop a business, a family business. He pays taxes, and his children have gone off to realize their potential. The journey was obviously not easy, and they had to overcome a lot of hurdles. However, 3 fundamental elements allowed my parents to realize themselves. The fact that they had the right to work when they arrived to the US, much like the Ukrainian refugees via the Temporary Protection Directive. My father also never lost his pride because Afghans at the time were perceived as heroes fighting the Soviets. Not to say that he was never subjected to racism. However, I realized that he did not suffer the same racism as African Americans or Mexicans in California. He was always able to keep his pride, and that is extremely important. He had access to finance, which allowed him to buy a house, and with that house he used the equity to start a business. Those 3 factors helped him succeed. And if an organization like Singa would have existed at the time, I'm pretty sure that rather than taking him 15 years to properly find his place, he could have done it probably in 5 years or even 3. Another reason why I was drawn to Singa is because their approach was not transactional. One time I participated in a collective of peers working in the same field, and someone said something like, "Migrants are makers, not takers." And I thought to myself, oh God, no, don't say that. It's creating another false perception. Migrants are human, and they can give and they can take. Singa is based on the idea of putting locals and newcomers on equal footing. We work to tell our volunteers that they will get as much from this experience as newcomers, if not more. As a US-born or French-born citizen, until you reach an age of adulthood, society invests in you. And when you become of age, you give back through the value you create via the work you do or the taxes you pay. So why shouldn't we have the same approach with migrants? How horrible is it to expect people that have lived through extreme trials and tribulations to give back right away? And lastly, despite what some might have you believe, by letting in those who only have a university degree or are highly qualified, well then, my dad would have never made it to the US, and I wouldn't be here today. My dad didn't go further than a high school degree, yet because the US gave him the space at the time, he was able to have access to his potential. I have spent my life seeing people around me not realize their potential because of bad policies, discrimination, and lack of access. Tomorrow, we will have 1.2 billion displaced people due to climate change. Nation-states are disappearing. It's happening now. If I could just say one thing, it's wake up, people. Please, wake up. Don't let fear get in the way of our collective future. Just stop building walls, both in real life and in your heads. Let's keep the bar high and help those in need. Because if my parents' experience taught me anything, it is that you never know when you will be in need. Peace and stability is not a given in any society. I often call Singa an oasis because we dare to foster an environment, a culture that demonstrates to the rest of society what is possible. Anything is possible if you open your mind and do not give into the mediocrity of those who want you to live in fear. I have stepped into my role as a social activist in my own way. And if I'm sharing this story, it is because of the maybe. Maybe my story will resonate with someone. Maybe. And that maybe is always worth fighting for.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you want to have more information on Singa, please check the caption. See you next Tuesday. Bye.